Okay, well, I'm here with Spencer Hess, and just a quick note, he will be flying solo on the channel early in 2021 with a review of Native by Caitlin Curtis. So I'm looking forward to that. And today, what I have Spencer on here for is to talk about the book that I went through fairly extensively not too long ago, McCara Hare's The Enchantments of Mammon. He read it at the same time I was going through the book. And so I wanted to have him on to just talk about the big picture, the takeaways, and some of his thoughts about more or less, American Christianity or the history of Christianity and maybe how it's been and how it could be different. So, Spencer, first of all, welcome again to the channel. Thanks for being here. And yep, you read this whole book. It's huge. It's over 800 pages. And I guess my first question is just what's your overall impression of this? Like, what do you make of it? Is his history of Christianity good enough? Did he go back far enough? Are you satisfied with it?
I mean, even like listening to interviews with him, he thinks that like the church as an institution is, I think he likes to say, bought and sold. So he doesn't seem to have hope in Orthodox Christian institutions,
Mm-hmm.
and hence his faith in Romanticism, as
Mm-hmm.
like the spirit of authentic Christianity has migrated.
So you read his interest in Romanticism as kind of this is where it's at as far as what's accessible to us.
I think so. Yeah. And I mean, I don't want to put words in his mouth because he also will like cop to being Roman Catholic. So I don't know exactly what's going on inside of him. But just go by going off of the book and his podcast interviews, he seems to not have much hope in Orthodox Christianity.
That's interesting. I would agree with you. Knowing that he's a Catholic and knowing that, and he is very attracted to Romanticism, but I also kind of felt attracted to like the romantic notion of medieval, social structures and religiosity, I guess. I sort of tied the two together, maybe particularly because of his Catholicism. And um, in effect, I guess I didn't have him like migrating his religious expectations into Romanticism as much. Is that really where you see him kind of going?
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, to your point, I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm just saying he's ambiguous and ambivalent.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Well,
as
like,
as is the connection between like medieval Christianity and like early modern Romanticism.
mm-hmm. Right. Hmm. So do you feel like so you're basically saying it would have been better if he had gone back farther, but however, he started at a good point because he started with modernity, which is where Christianity really starts going wrong.
Well, I mean, you and I have had this argument before. I don't think that's when Christianity went wrong. I think it's been going wrong since the beginning,
Mhm.
or very early on.
Mhm.
Which isn't to say it didn't get worse. Um, but no, I would say it wouldn't be a better or worse book. It would just be a different book, and I would personally prefer that different book. But I mean, he makes a hell of an argument as a sort of like amped up, politicized, more topical sequel to A Secular Age. So
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
rad.
yeah. I really, as I read it, I kept thinking about all the parallels with Charles Taylor's Secular Age, and the whole theme of disenchantment and re-enchantment. And of course, McCarraher thinks that really, I mean, he would disagree with Taylor, in the sense that there's never been, no, not totally, but, McCarraher, there's never was really a disenchantment. We just moved our enchantment into Mammonism, basically. I mean,
Right.
right?
Which is why he insists on calling it misenchantment.
Yeah, misenchantment. Yeah. Do you agree with that? I mean, what do you think of his history of American Christianity in particular?
Yeah, it fits in pretty well with everything I've studied in the past. I
Mm-hmm.
find it pretty convincing and persuasive.
Mm-hmm. I mean, should we like going all the way back to like the colonization of America, with the Puritans?
Mhm.
He basically says that, these people fairly early on started to make this mistake where productivity was kind of following Weber. Productivity was a sign of godliness.
Find favor and yeah.
Mhm. Yep. And he's similar to Taylor in, like, they discovered that they could indeed control a whole lot
Mhm.
and, become even more productive by doing so. And then at some point, this becomes kind of unhinged from the original intent. And then Christianity gloms onto productivity and profit and accumulation and what he loves to call pecuniary interest,
Mhm.
right? And I mean, so like, I'm sure a lot of people reading this would be like, oh, I think he's going a bit too far because he paints almost every Christian step in America as in the direction of Mammonism, the confusion with pecuniary interest. Um, but then he does talk about like other movements, other people along the way who have a different point of view, but their point of view is never as strong
Mhm.
as the central, theme in American Christianity. Um, so like,
Although I would object here that it doesn't, even with what he talks about in the book, this isn't an American problem. This is Christianity and a kind of Aristotelian philosophy justifying why the Spanish and the Portuguese can go and claim colonies. And this is justifying enclosure and uh, Protestantism in a way justifying closing or what do they? There's a name for it. Like basically when the aristocracy took control of the monasteries and closed them down in England,
yeah. Mm-hmm.
and enclosure in general. That at the very least, this starts in the Renaissance in Italy.
Mm-hmm. And it becomes whereas prior to this, there was some sort of sanctimony or sanctity, I should say, some sort of sanctity attached to poverty, right? Um,
Mm-hmm.
and or at least poverty or being poor wasn't considered being also morally in the wrong,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Sure.
And with this change in enclosure, in consolidating property, getting rid of the commons, um, they start to make this connection. If you're poor, that means you're unproductive. If you're unproductive, you're not working hard enough. You're not working hard enough. You're not godly enough, right? There's something wrong with you in that regard.
Mm-hmm.
And then like the accumulation and profitability becomes a sign of your godliness.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And America's got that, like, full blown, right? Like from the beginning, that connection.
And at this point, they've colonized even the Catholics and the Orthodox, like with a capital O. I run into characters like this in the last few years that will, and you talk about politics, and they'll say like the economy, the economy, the economy.
Right.
Like you're Eastern Orthodox, you know, like, but they're not. They're Protestants, and
Uh-huh.
they're by Mammon. So
Right. Yeah. I mean, I have met a few over the years of late, over the past, few years that look very much askance at anybody who's getting some sort of, welfare or handout from the church, right? They want to needs test them. They want to, they assume that the more or less people who are in need are trying to scam or get away with something. And I think that kind of like, in a way, it expresses the heart of what McCarraher is talking about, right? In the turn away from one type of Christianity and the perversion of it into kind of like collapsing it into um, more or less capitalist self-interest.
Mhm.
I don't know
Sure.
if I'm articulating that right, but
Right. And I would go along with that as long as we keep in mind the caveat that like it's not like the High Middle Ages was some sort of Christian utopia
yeah,
where the clerics and the nobles were all living up to their ideals.
right.
And what they formally preached is what they acted out.
Yeah, yeah, of course. And that's good. I'm glad that you said that. Yeah. I think the ideal is what changed, right? The ideal or what they would have said was true about the poor in,
Right.
feudal would be from a Christian perspective would be different from what you would say about the poor now in contemporary America.
Sure. Yeah, and I would argue Charles Taylor too, in his book, does a good job of laying out that transformation.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Yeah. Yeah. Well, so like I wanted to spend quite a bit of time today talking about just like, towards the end of the book, how he does kind of begin to get into the zone of what he would prefer as opposed to what American Christianity, in his view, has become. Right? It's become largely, mammon. It's the worship of mammon. It's a sort of almost bureaucratic. It's almost like the American church mirrors the corporate or neoliberal structure. But he has a different view of what Christians and what the church should do. So I wanted to talk quite a bit about that. I mean, what was your perception of what he wanted as opposed to what we have? And then, like, do you agree with that? I guess, like, first, let's untangle what do we think that he wanted?
Well, if that outro is anything to go by, um, he advocates sort of Bernie Sanders style. He talks about Bernie Sanders being a synthesis of the best of like New Deal American liberalism fused with European social democracy.
Mm-hmm.
And he does say he thinks that's the solution to the social question, as
Mm-hmm.
you call it. And then he's clearly very sympathetic in this book and in interviews for anarchism in general. Um, and so he holds up Occupy Wall Street as a positive step, and even if it didn't pull off what they wanted, it was at least sort of prophetic. I think he quotes David Graeber as it's like the first salvo in a war for the imagination. Um, which for me was a little hard to swallow. Like he uses these like literal like, Pentecostal, like the tongues of fire, where it seems a little bit much to say people saying that your student loan debt should be canceled and we should share and people on Wall Street should pay their taxes. Um,
Is he making the same mistake, maybe in a weird kind of way, of reducing um, Christian spirituality into the, in this case, certain socialist proposals? You know what I mean?
I think he's doing a lot of things, and one slice of what he is doing is kind of reducing Christianity to a kind of progressive Christianity that ends in you voting for Democrats and subscribing to sojourners. And
Yeah.
I don't want to reduce what he's doing only to that, but that's in play. And um,
Right. By the
I,
way, I've subscribed to Sojourners, but then
I
I didn't subscribe again because it's boring. But
it really is.
it is.
Um, uh,
Mm,
it really is. So I guess if I, with the caveat that this is a great book and he spent 20 years writing it and it's excellent in all sorts of ways, I think he could do a better job of suturing up um, these disparate ideas. Um,
yeah.
but
Yeah.
yeah, so like a Sandinista platform,
Uh-huh.
uh, sort of a sort of non-dogmatic American kind of anarchism. He also holds up like artisanal production. as something productive, and that would open up the space, he says, for us to like philosophically interrogate what's good work, what's useful work, what's um
And
what
which
so
I totally like that, like I like that suggestion that if artisanal production can mean basically people kind of taking responsibility back for what they produce and really kind of ownership in the large sense, of what they produce. That makes sense. I What I don't know is can that vision of artisanal production, maybe communalism, can that coexist with Bernie Sanders socialism? Are those two things compatible? I mean, I feel like they might not be compatible, that, and maybe I mean, if we're talking about anarchism, the communalism of anarchism, right, or Christian anarchism, it's people deciding how they're going to do things kind of amongst themselves, right? And taking pride in what they do because they have this immediate ownership of it. They make the decisions and so on. In socialism, you're talking about, and I'm not disagreeing necessarily that we need it, because I do think, I mean, we've come to such a passes that we probably would be better off with it, but I don't know how compatible it is. I don't know how much more compatible it is than the type of capitalism we currently have with a Christian worldview.
And I guess my argument would be that you're right, pushed to their extremes, these things are incompatible. On the other hand, in practice and in theory, people hold all sorts of contradictory things together.
Yeah, true
Uh,
enough.
and this doesn't seem more, unless the Marxists are right and that there's some fundamental like labor theory of value type thing that would be broken. It's that type of politics would be more compatible with the flourishing of Catholic worker houses and farms um, than the current neoliberal model where we're redistributing tons of money to banks and to the military industrial complex.
Right. Well, I think in a way you're assuming that the democratic socialists wouldn't also do the same. But
Sure.
I, you know, yeah,
Yeah.
I get your larger point that a certain amount of anarchism or communalism could coexist in a socialist system and maybe better than under the current system. Maybe.
Right.
In practical sense.
And at their best, they would be complementary if it could be worked out. Now, there's no guarantee. There's like a million problems to solve. Um,
Right.
but I think there's always going to be like internal tensions and antagonisms in a society.
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe this gets us to one big question that is always, like as I read this book and even before, just in general, a big question in my mind is what should Christian churches be doing as opposed to what they are doing? So let's talk a little bit about that, because I think that, I mean, anybody who would be serious about Christian community or creating something close to what he wants, if like on the anarchism side of the equation, that change would ideally come from Christian churches, entities that already exist all over this country, all over the world, right, in
Although,
every community.
right. Although this is where he's implicitly insistent that's not going to happen.
Now let's talk about that. Like, what's your perception of why he thought that wasn't going to happen?
It, like I said, he regards them as bought and sold,
Okay,
and that the
unpack,
pastor,
unpack that. Like, what do you mean bought and sold?
they've are. I mean, the, to go with his metaphor, they've sold their souls to money and to basically power.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, how does that, for people who don't haven't either lived in that world or aren't intimately connected with or thinking about it, like, what does that really mean, they've sold their soul? Like, what goes on in a church? Like, if you never went to a church, if you're talking to somebody who never went to a church, like, how would you explain to them how they've sold their souls? I really want people to understand this point. Like,
So there's a lot of ways it can pan out. I guess I'll speak anecdotally from my own experience, being on the outs with the church I've been going to since I moved here. One of the ways you sell out, I think, is they just take a liberal framework, and like in the wider sense that like you've talked about on your channel, right? Whether you're a conservative or you're a liberal or a progressive, you're still in this like framework that's thoroughgoingly liberal.
mm-hmm.
So one of the things I've encountered, like in the sermons that the pastors give, is there's this like sort of the height of sort of Christian morality applied to politics is to be tolerant, basically. And so to accept that, well, if you're a Democrat, you might disagree with the Republican across the aisle or vice versa, but let's like respect other people's views.
Mm-hmm.
And at no point do they call you to ask, maybe you should go beyond even respecting their views and that you have differing opinions, but maybe you should actively consider what they have to say, and then self-critique your own opinions, and then try and figure out if, like, measure them against the yardstick of truth to the best that you can, and then try and synthesize and incorporate what's right about their view and your view.
Mm-hmm.
This level.
That message, I must say. I've never heard that message either. Yeah.
Right. And part of it, I mean, I think it feeds into the sort of culture of narcissism stuff where it's about like the highest ideal to strive towards is just acceptance and toleration. And it's not to critique yourself. It's not to actively engage with the other person. It's not to come to some sort of mutual understanding.
Mm-hmm.
It's just to like tolerate. And they don't put it this cynically because maybe either it would be seen like how lame what they're asking you to do really is, would be my argument.
I mean, they're asking you to do something that our entire system kind of tells you to do. It's nothing particular to Christianity, to be tolerant, right? Which just means to, let them think what they want to think without, more or less, persecuting them, which is a sort of shallow respect. But in a church, if you can't, or any community, if you can't get beyond that to actually considering each other's positions, you can never like come together and act in concert.
Sure. But that too is not on the table.
Right. And that I think those two things are very much intertwined, right? Like this is what I felt. And I'm a Catholic, but I've been a Protestant as well. I was a Lutheran before I was a Catholic, and I was a Presbyterian before I was a Lutheran. And I don't know, I was mainly those three, but I don't remember any time a church suggested that we act in concert about something. Now, that's not to say they suggest that you participate in a food drive, or you can help out and volunteer, this and that and the other thing. That's not what I'm talking about, but I'm talking about like closer, like agreement and cooperation of a group of people that actually pursue goals together. To do that, you'd have to have it, you'd have to have kind of hashed it out with each other more.
Mm-hmm. But that's not what they're in the business of. Like, and this, or to put it in a way that like McCare doesn't quite put it in, but like if medieval Christendom was, though flawed, like a good way to order social relations, let's say, they've regressed beyond that because they're not interested in ordering society. They're interested in sort of your internal, again, whether you're Catholic or Orthodox, you're still, I would argue, like practically we're Protestants. They're interested in the administration of the sacraments, preaching the gospel and the ideas through these, They're inflected differently in different denominations, but that's how souls will be saved. Um, and then this fits very well in with a liberal framework where everybody's religion is a privatized affair. And then we all, in the public sphere, we just get together and we work.
Mm.
And there's this anti ideological claim that like we're all just living in a consensual world where functionally like mammon dictates what we do. Um,
Yeah.
and
There's like this, this split between the 90% of my life in which I am an economic actor and a person with a private life.
yes,
And my 10%, if we're lucky, right? 10 or 5% or whatever, that's over here that does this church stuff
mm-hmm.
every once in a while.
Right. Yeah, and we might do some ministries that are worth doing. Maybe they run a food pantry. Maybe they sometimes do childcare and vacation Bible schools.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I don't want to get completely one-sided, but if if you're not willing to actively challenge people's beliefs politically, you're sure not going to try and organize people along alternative economic or political or social. Um,
Right.
yeah. Other than, I mean, unless there are these camps where they do funnel you into usually the Republican Party, but some of them, like Sojourners, they'll funnel you into being a Democrat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's fairly common, right? Like and a lot of times they'll do both. They'll preach tolerance of each other in the church, but at the same time, that church is either a Republican church or a Democrat church. I mean, here in Manhattan, there's maybe two or three Democrat churches. The rest are more or less Republican churches, like, and everybody knows like what their political stances are. If you go to one, the pastor is gonna preach that message of toleration, but they're also going to preach a lot of politics as well. But still, the preaching of politics or the implication of politics doesn't translate into um, any sort of collective action. And by that I mean like people working with each other to benefit each other in the community, right? Instead, they do things like the
These are
food.
nonsense terms under liberalism.
Yeah. Yeah, I want to make sure I'm clear. Like, obviously, churches of all kinds do a lot of charitable work, right? And this is considered kind of like the height of, the Christianity in action is doing things like having a food pantry, doing a weekly meal, all of which is really good. But what they don't ever do is like take they're, like this is, I don't know if I'm going too far here, but it doesn't seem like they ever take care of each other. Did you ever feel like in any church you've ever been in that there was really any real strong attempt for people in the church to like take care of each other?
No, and to the extent that I did growing up, it was maybe like in visiting my grandma's church in a small town where I suspect it had more to do with just being in a small town that hadn't been like fully modernized up to
Yeah.
the current day than anything explicit preached or taught.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Because like we were talking about McCarraher's goal of encouraging a sort of Christian communalism as layered in there with his preference for socialism, but one could detach it. um you know One never hears about inward facing action. It's always outward facing, and it usually has to do with giving money, but sometimes it has to do with action. But it's always, we're going to help X, Y, and Z. We're going to do missionary work and help, people in some other country and maybe evangelize them. We're going to, do a collection for people who need Thanksgiving dinners. But, to put it simply, I think that, if churches were going to approximate what McCarraher wanted, they'd become more of an actual community that took care of each other first and then emanated that outwards and maybe drew people in simply because they were so good at caring for each other.
Sure. But I think this is where, to use words that he doesn't use, but I think it's a fair representation of what he's saying, that churches have been so colonized by capital, or mammon or money or what have you, that not only are they not doing this, they can't even conceive of what we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
We might
Yeah.
as well be aliens.
Right, right. I agree with you. And I've had just a rare conversation with people from church over the years about things like this. And I can tell you that's pretty much true. They either don't know what you're talking about or they feel kind of afraid, they're kind of scared of what you're talking about because it requires a real different kind of, I don't know, just like a different level of involvement. And it also requires kind of like a, right now, like a lot of American churches are, they've got a staff, right? And the staff provides services, youth ministry, outreach, this, that, and the other thing.
Later. Yeah.
Right.
Social justice chair or whatever they would call it. Yeah.
If we did this, if we had more of like a real Christian community in churches, we wouldn't need those salaried people doing this stuff, would we now? Come to think of it.
I mean, unless we got to pure anarchism of some sort, you would still need people to direct things.
Yeah.
So I would argue if you were a church leadership team and you had some balls, there are various things you could do to tend towards Christian anarchism that would not inherently destroy your job prospects.
Okay. Oh, that's a hopeful thought. I was going in the cynical direction, like, oh, they're probably circling around the wagons, protecting their jobs.
And I think all sorts of phenomena, all sorts of toxic phenomena in the world can at least be partly explained by somebody needs to protect their job, or create their job by making a lot of noise about this or that.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't looked into it a lot, but I already like pretty much believe in this theory of like overproduced elites. And why do we need like a social justice chair of the church? Partly it's because like there's no way to organize group like the church anarchistically to deal with this. So it becomes one more position of somebody with a bachelor's, or better yet, like a master's or a PhD in some sort of critical theory, or social justicely inclined seminarian to come along and usually direct funds towards some issue or some community or this or that.
Yeah, I have to say that stuff makes my head hurt real hard. It really does. Like, I just, I cringe when I see either a university or church hiring yet another person to do something that people ought to just be kind of doing and probably could do a lot better without this additional,
Sure.
labor.
But to play devil's advocate, this is how you get shit done in this society. You raise money for it. You pay someone to administer the services and or the money.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you've just described, like the neoliberal model right there, right? Like you pay for everything, you get services, you mission accomplished, you can check that box off because you've hired somebody and they've accomplished, task 1, 2, and 3, right? And it's a very instrumental way of thinking. And at the end of the year, you've got a report that says, we did 1, 2, and 3, and because we hired this person. And next year he'll do like 4, 5, and 6. And we're, making progress. And oftentimes this involves, additional, I don't know what, infrastructure building.
Because you're creating jobs in the construction sector. It's crucial for capital.
Right, right. And yeah, so many things to talk about, but I think like maybe better than going down the path of this, which I mean, believe me, I have like a whole craw full of like stuff to talk about when it comes to this. What, just one example, and then I'll ask my question, but like my church a couple of years ago started yet another capital campaign, right? And I always hate it when I hear about the capital campaign, because the capital campaign is always about building something physical. They're going to build a wing, they're going to build a gym, they're going to build like another addition, whatever. I don't think they're using the building that they've already got very well. It's empty most of the time. It's not being utilized to help people a lot of the time, whatever. And so that's sort of already irritating. And then the way that they sell it is so deeply ingrained with market thinking, right? Like it's, we can add this many more seats. We'll bring in this more, much more revenue. We'll be able to offer this many more services. They quantify everything. They put it in charts. They get like the influential people in the church to do like promo videos for it. I mean,
and they are asking you to be the consumer / investor.
Yeah.
In
right.
this company.
That's exactly the way it feels. And it just is, it's,
which I mean, to give it the best argument it can, it's asking for your participation and for you to be involved in what the church is doing. So to that extent, I would argue it's a good thing.
I mean, they're asking you to be involved in what they've already decided without you by writing a check. That's how they want you
to put the bill, because I think it's true, and it's kind of implicit throughout this book. Money is like a dominating force that gets people to do things.
Right.
And it's easier for them to ask you for money than to ask you to learn how to actively contribute to the church.
Yeah.
Or help build it or whatever.
It's this magical thing, right, that I've worked for. So it's already one step removed. It comes into my bank account. And then, I can dole out a little bit or a lot to this project over here. So now it's a couple of steps removed. So in other words, like I can feel like I'm doing something positive by supporting, by buying a few bricks in the facade of the addition. But I don't have to actually like be a part of the decision-making process or do anything else related to it. So it's a nice way of making you feel like you've done something and feel like you've been involved.
Sure.
But really,
Yeah, I think so. And I would argue he doesn't really talk about this. And like, if I wrote the book, I would like to think I would talk more about this. Part of it is they have a theology where, why do we need this new capital outlay? It's, well, we're going to build a gym. Why are we going to build a gym? Because that's going to bring the kids, and then we can save souls. And so there is a way in which it becomes rationalized if their mission is just to draw people in so that they buy into the cult. And I mean cult in like a very general sense. I don't mean that as the sort of insulting way we generally mean it.
Right.
But the way to induce them so that you can theologically cultivate them. And if those are the horizons of your how you're trying to shape souls, then that would be both a means to do it and socially the path of least resistance.
It is the path of least resistance because it ultimately just doesn't ask all that much of you. The most it asks of you is to increase your giving, but that's fairly easy compared to.
In the process, lots of construction materials are purchased. A certain amount of labor is employed.
Mm-hmm. So you can say that you're employing somebody.
Yeah, and even if they might not make the argument, but I think that's in part what's going on.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with that, and I don't want to sound like I'm totally negative simply because it is asking a lot for people to kind of like, I don't know, separate themselves from the way we normally think. Like, our entire lives are conditioned by this way of thinking. This is how we get things done. We make money and we spend money, and we generally make our decisions about what we spend on the basis of other people's recommendations. And I mean that in a very big sense, like advertising and, so we don't really we're not called upon to think for ourselves or act on our own a great deal in the rest of our existence. So to do that in a religious setting is asking a lot. And so, I think this is McCara Hare's argument too, is that the church becomes just sort of like a mirror of the rest of society, of the society's values and practices. And this is recognizable to people, right? Like most people are comfortable with this because, it's a language that they speak.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is. And I think it's possible somebody listening to this would hear us just mainly critiquing the church hierarchies for not being imaginative or risky enough.
Okay. Yeah.
But if we want to, I guess, to put it crudely, if we want to take part in the great modernist tradition of like castrating the father or the patriarchal figure, why would we assume that the priests and the pastors are any less colonized internally than we are?
Right.
Why would they also not be thinking in terms of, well, I'm a provider of a service. I need to meet the consumers where they are
Mm-hmm.
and give them, it's a kind of argument for like demand side economics in a way.
Oh.
And so this is what the people want, and so I just kind of tail them.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
And maybe try to, you try to educate them a little bit along the way. You provide the insights. Like in a lot of Christian churches, it's, like I can tell you what this Bible passage really means, so I'll educate you, along the way. But yeah, I I don't think you're wrong about that at all. I think most pastors and priests do see themselves as service providers.
yeah, which for me, I mean, to put my cards on the table, this for me is like an act, like a de facto theodical crisis. Like, how could the church degenerate like this? Like, if God's watching over it, how did everything get so messed up?
No, man, that's a big question. Like for a Catholic, our answer, because it's been messed up for pretty much the entire time.
Sure.
Pretty much not
Especially so since I've been paying attention.
right, like with short intervals of like flashes of light in the midst of a sea of pretty bad stuff.
Mhm.
That the Catholic answer is basically that God's ultimately in charge and won't let this totally steer people off a cliff. But then again, we're kind of about ready to head off a cliff in a lot of ways, or at
Yeah.
least it feels like it. And so I don't
Yeah.
know. It's a big question, like I'd prefer to think that, God gives people this, you've heard me say this so many times, but this freedom to make, and we've been making some seriously bad decisions for a long, long time.
Mhm.
With the idea that, people will eventually like understand their mistakes because the price is so high. But yeah.